Hi everyone, it's Katrina. The Vimana. The Vimana is a powerful flying machine described in Sanskrit texts from ancient India. We can find mention of the Vimana in all kinds of these ancient writings, from the Ramayana to the Yajurveda. It's almost always described as the same thing. It was an enormous temple or a palace which could fly through the sky like a floating city. Not only could the Vimana travel through the atmosphere, but they could also fly to space and dive underwater. Imagine the biggest temple you can think of, but it can launch itself into space to visit other planets. Weirdly enough, legends of the Vimana gave specific details about how the mysterious thing achieved its flight. It was described as having at least 2 engines, although no one can explain how the ancients even knew what an engine was. The flying fortress was also said to have deadly weapons, things that could wipe out entire civilizations. They could be used for ordinary travel to get from one place to another, or for warfare. Scientifically, there is no evidence that the Vimana was real. Archaeologists have never found any proof that flying machines soared above the skies of India, but that doesn't mean one didn't exist. Judging by how many stories of flying machines there are in ancient Indian texts, the idea came from somewhere, maybe somebody or something, which was mistaken for a god by the original inhabitants of India, visited using an advanced spaceship. But because the locals understood nothing about space travel, they just described it as a flying temple. What do you think? Just ancient mythology or something else? Let me know in the comments below. The stone monuments of Nuku-Hiva. These stone monuments of Nuku-Hiva are quite strange. For those unfamiliar with this place, Nuku-Hiva is a large French Polynesian island in the Pacific Ocean. It's famous for the stone monuments scattered across its beautiful and isolated landscape. Most of these stone monuments are at a small settlement called Temehea Tohua. Archaeologists say they were created between the 11th and 14th centuries, and that every statue is a depiction of one of the ancient deities of Nuku-Hiva. And although these deities are ancient, some are still being worshipped today. What we know is that the original inhabitants of this tropical island arrived several thousand years ago, and although their culture has changed since then, their origin story has remained more or less the same. According to the people of Nuku-Hiva, the god of creation is Ono. He created the Polynesian islands as a gift to his wife, taking the earth and turning it into a giant palace. But that palace eventually decayed, and the islands are what remains of its walls and roof. Another interesting thing about these people is that there were once way too many of them. The island itself had about 100,000 people. This made it almost impossible for communities to live and eat. They had food shortages, there weren't enough fish, and supposedly the people of the island resorted to organized cannibalism. Under the trees of Nuku-Hiva and beyond, the tropical coastline has a secret history of blood and death. The Roman financial crisis. When most of us think about ancient Rome, we think of wealth, powerful armies, and an undying legacy. But there is a less talked about, more forbidden part of Roman history that may just be a warning for our own grim future. Historian Charles Bartlett recently compared something that happened in Rome 2,000 years ago to the economic crisis of 2008. In the year 33 AD, the Roman Empire plunged into economic chaos. This happened when rulers passed a law that required creditors to invest part of their capital in Italian lands. The money was used to help with agriculture, create more beautiful pieces of architecture, and solidify the foundation of Rome. Everyone was supposed to be a winner. But what happened is that creditors rushed to buy as much land as they could. It created a credit crunch. The Roman Emperor Tiberius had to free up vast sums of money for interest-free loans to stop the crisis from getting any worse. In simple terms, land became suddenly valuable in Italy. Those with the credit to purchase the land did it as quickly as they could, but to do it they had to call in all their debts. Debtors then went broke. They purchased too much land and prices dropped. There was a desperate buy and sell spree, credit was non-existent, and the land value plummeted as interest rates were driven up sharply. It was a mess, almost like what happened in 2008. What many people don't realize is that the same thing that happened in the modern world already happened in the Roman world. And we all know how that ended. The prophet Daniel. The prophecy of Daniel is a book in the Old Testament, and like anything having to do with the Bible, there is a great divide between what archaeologists say and what the religious believers say. But what happens when that line is blurred? To give you an example, scholars didn't think King David was a real person until 1993, when they discovered artifacts in Jerusalem proving beyond a doubt that King David lived and breathed. Theologians did not believe that Belshazzar was an actual figure, but just a character in the Bible. Daniel, in chapters 5, 7, and 8, mentions Belshazzar 8 times, and in the year 1854, archaeologists discovered 4 ancient cuneiform cylinders in Ur, the greatest city of Old Babylonia. These cylinders mentioned Belshazzar, son of King Nabonidus. No matter which side you're on, science or faith, archaeological evidence shows much of what was written in the prophecy of Daniel is non-fiction. Look at King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, between 605 BC and 562 BC. The Bible says he was driven away from men and ate grass like an ox, while his hair grew like feathers and his nails became birds' claws. Historians believe this part of the Bible can be explained by a weird psychological disease called boanthropy. It's when a person goes completely insane and acts like a cow, walking on all fours in a field and eating grass. It's a strange mental disorder allegedly brought on by dreams or hypnotism. The Knights Templar. On Christmas 1119, Baldwin II, king of Jerusalem, persuaded a group of French knights to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. This was the formation of the Order of the Knights Templar. These knights lived like monks, took vows of chastity and poverty, and would protect peasants and civilians against enemies using violence. At least this was how they started. But just shy of 200 years later, in 1314, the Crusades were over. The church abolished the Templars, and they burned the Grand Master of the order at the stake in Paris. It was a miserable and fiery end for what is one of the most mysterious orders that ever existed. One thing you might not know is the connection between the Freemasons and the Knights Templar. Spoiler alert, there isn't one. Frank Sanello, a professional historian, explained in 2003 that Andrew Ramsay, a senior French Freemason of the 18th century, made up the link between the Freemasons and the Crusaders. He was the first one to claim that the Freemasons had descended from the order. It was all a trick to appeal to the French aristocracy to get more members. What's your favorite conspiracy theory involving the Knights Templar? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. The Hill of Torture. On a hilltop in Auriesville, New York, is the Hill of Torture. On this hill is something that most Americans have probably never heard of. There is a shrine dedicated to 3 American martyrs of the 17th century. They are a trio who shed their blood for Christ right on this very spot in the 1640s. They were actually missionaries trying to convert the Native Americans, who weren't really interested, and you can probably understand why. Invading their land, bringing disease, and insulting their religion. You get it. But these 3 died pretty awful deaths. These 3 martyrs had been trying to spread the word of Jesus to the New World. Father Isaac Jogues died from being hit in the head with a tomahawk. Ren Goupil and John Lalande had their fingernails ripped out and their teeth pulled one by one. Their torture was so heinous that the men went down in history as martyrs and were given their own holy hill in New York. The Sanayaled Plates. The Sanayaled Plates are fake nonsense, or are some of the most priceless artifacts in the world. Experts can't quite figure it out. The lead plates were supposedly cast from the solid gold originals, with the inscriptions of an unknown language, a language made with the Greek alphabet and a few random unknown characters. They were discovered in a warehouse at the Bucharest Museum of Antiquities in Romania back in the 1800s. There were 200 pieces in the collection, and nobody has any idea where they came from. They just showed up there. Photos were taken proving that there were indeed 200 pieces, but only 35 are left today. When they were first found, professionals at the museum disregarded the plates as forgeries. They looked too new. They couldn't find any traces of erosion on the plates, and the gold originals were nowhere to be found. Still, these treasures were valuable enough to be removed in 1916 when World War I broke out. It wasn't until 2003 that interest was renewed in the mysterious artifacts. Some said the original gold copies had been kept at the Sanayaled Monastery in Romania, then used to build Peles Castle. Nobody has ever deciphered the language on the plates. Plus, an analysis by the Institute of Atomic Physics concluded they were probably made from lead in the 19th century. And so, the mystery of the plates continues. The treasure of the Yanganatis. The treasure of the Yanganatis is another bizarre trove of artifacts that may or may not be real. This treasure comprises massive amounts of gold, silver, and electrum, relics that are supposedly hidden deep in Ecuador in the Yanganatis mountain range. The Incan general Rumi Nahui put them there in the 16th century. To understand this better, we need to start at 1532 with Francisco Pizarro. He established the town of San Miguel de Piura and began his glorious conquest of the Inca Empire. He captured King Atahualpa at Cajamarca, and the king offered to give him vast amounts of gold for his life and freedom. Naturally, Francisco agreed. Things went wrong quickly. The Spaniard didn't trust the Inca king, and he had him killed in July 1533. But according to legend, his general, Rumi Nahui, had been on his way there with the gold for the ransom at the time of the king's death. When he learned of the treachery, he changed his course and hauled the treasure deep into the mountains. It's allegedly still there, somewhere hiding in a cave or at the bottom of a lake. The Meowing nuns. There is a bizarre story about a case of mass hysteria which possessed a secluded convent of nuns in France during the Middle Ages. We don't have an exact year, but the nuns were apparently overcome with the desire to meow like cats. These nuns slowly went insane, meowing for hours at a time, and would only stop when soldiers beat and whipped them. Shortly after this original case, the same thing happened in Germany in the 15th century. This time, a group of nuns bit each other. News traveled through the region, and other nuns at other nunneries had the same problem. It was a biting epidemic, and it spread as far as Holland and Rome. This is a real thing that happened based on historical records all across Europe, and yet nobody knows why it happened. Reports from the 15th century say the nuns would continue to bite each other until they were exhausted. They meowed like cats, bit strangers, and it was all around very weird. It only stopped when religious leaders turned to the civil authorities to have the nuns flogged, dunked in barrels of water, and thrown in prison. Order was eventually restored, and there have been very few outbreaks of biting mania ever since. The Church of the Holy Sepulcher. In Jerusalem, there are thousands of tiny medieval crosses carved into the walls of the holiest church in the world. It's the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, the sacred site allegedly built on the place where the Romans crucified Jesus. Religious scholars have chalked up the crosses to graffiti left behind by medieval pilgrims. A recent study of the crosses shows they were masons. Researcher Amit Raem analyzed every inch of each cross on the wall. He looked at the depth, the width, and the hand of the people who carved them. What he discovered is that the crosses were likely all carved by the same person, or by just one or two people. Why did they do this? The best guess archaeologists have is that pilgrims from all over Europe journeyed to the church and then paid a stonemason to carve a cross for them on the wall. They saved the dust created by the carving as a sacred keepsake. Pilgrims probably put the dust in a small lead flask, then took it home as their own piece of the Holy Land. And while the case of the crosses is mysterious, the church itself is the big mystery here. We know the Church of the Holy Sepulcher was built in the 4th century. According to legend, it was the mother of the great Roman Emperor Constantine, Saint Helena, who traveled to Jerusalem and discovered the exact spot where Jesus had been crucified, buried, and subsequently resurrected. Constantine then had the basilica built, which became the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. In modern times, no proof has ever been discovered that this was the place where Jesus Christ came back to life. Yorkshire's lost Atlantic. There is a lost city somewhere off the coast of England that archaeologists call Yorkshire's Atlantis. It's a fabled medieval town whose real name was Ravensor Odd, but nobody knew where it was for over 650 years. 1,500 years ago, give or take a few centuries, Raven-sur-Aude was a prosperous port town built on a sandbank where the coast meets the river. But a storm in 1362 caused water levels to rise, and the flood swept people's homes away. The survivors had no choice but to retreat inland. Ever since, the foundations of the town have been hiding underwater. And although we don't technically know where it is, we know it's down there somewhere. Professor Daniel Parsons at the University of Hull has taken an almost obsessive interest in the lost town and is currently trying to find it. The professor believes the remnants of the town are sitting on the seabed, and they have actually been seen several times at low tide by commercial lobster fishermen. He raised enough money for a research project, but after searching an area of almost 25 acres, they found no evidence of the lost city. They will do a second survey in 2022, and the researchers hope that this time they'll discover the mystery of the sunken city. They are also hoping to prove a point about how quickly climate change can destroy a coastal town. Hope you don't live too close to the water. Underwater cannibals. Scientists have discovered a shocking group of underwater cannibals. I'm not talking about mermaids that eat each other or some weird tribe of aquatic humans with a hunger for human flesh. No, researchers discovered teeny tiny sea creatures that have a predilection for eating their own siblings to bolster their own survival. The animals are baby sea stars, and although they look innocent and harmless, they cannibalize each other no problem. A pair of researchers discovered the behavior by accident while observing baby Forbes sea stars. At first, they were trying to find out how these small sea creatures would react when introduced to killer crabs in a lab. But Professor John Allen instead watched in disbelief as the baby sea stars began eating one another. John hadn't even put the crabs in yet. They had to scrap the whole experiment and study something new altogether. It was pretty disturbing. We can find these sea stars on the east coast of the United States, with adults growing to around 9 inches long. But baby stars are only about the size of a pinhead. An adult female sea star can lay between 5 and 10 million eggs a year. They undergo a process of metamorphosis in which they gradually transform from their tiny selves into their adult selves, just like how caterpillars turn into butterflies. But in order to store up enough energy to do this, the sea stars need a lot of food, and there's a lot of competition. If that food is not around, they'll settle for eating their brothers and sisters. The Terror. In the year 1845, the great Sir John Franklin led the most famous expedition in Arctic history. 2 ships sailed away from Britain, the HMS Terror and the HMS Erebus. They were searching for a way through the Northwest Passage to link Europe with Asia. During this time, there was a race to see who could find a faster way to get to Asia to be able to trade. The first person to do this would have made a fortune. But Sir Franklin and his crew of 128 men would never make it. The ships got stuck near King William Island, and every one of them met a tragic and often painful death. In the 1980s, expedition members in Canada found the mummified remains of some of the crew frozen in ice, as well as evidence they had died from cold and hunger, lead poisoning from eating canned food, and cannibalism. Some had gotten so hungry, they were resorting to eating each other. Then, years later, in 2014, scientists finally found the wreckage of the HMS Erebus in Arctic water near King William Island, kind of where everyone thought it would be. 2 years later, they discovered the HMS Terror not far away. The boats are still sitting underwater, looking exactly the same as they did nearly 200 years ago when they first got stuck. The ships have yet to be salvaged. Even though they've been inspected using remotely operated underwater vehicles, there is no way to bring these enormous vessels to the surface and get them to a museum. The only thing they have recovered so far is the ship's bell from the HMS Erebus. The UK has conceded the rights to the shipwreck to Canada, so it's up to them what they decide to do in the future. Sunken temple. Thailand is currently experiencing one of the worst droughts in history. The drought has been going on for about 10 years, and while it's devastating for the people, it has led to a rather unexpected discovery. A sunken Buddhist temple recently re-emerged from its watery prison, attracting local tourists who decorate the temple's broken statues with flowers and kneel to pray. The temple, along with the surrounding village, was all lost underwater in 1999 when the Thai government constructed a new dam. It's called Wat Nong Bua Yai Temple, and it was once famous for its massive Buddha statue over 13 feet tall. As of right now, the statue is missing its head, but there are other pieces of the temple still standing, like its huge gateway arch, a gateway to a riverbed, and some old pieces of stone. Before they flooded the temple, it was a meeting place for people from several surrounding villages. People would come just to hang out, take part in rituals, and celebrate during traditional festivals. Now, 20 years later, the temple is coming back to life. Ice Age carnivores. In an underwater cave in Mexico, scientists recently discovered fossils of animals that have been extinct for thousands of years. One of these creatures is an ancient wolf-like coyote, something previously believed to have only lived in South America. Researchers also found the bones of short-faced bears, which was a surprise because everyone thought they hadn't gotten that far north during the Ice Age. Scientists now believe these animals, and likely many other species just as ancient, originated in North America, slowly migrated to South America through Panama, and then migrated back up again just before they went extinct. Researchers also found the complete skeleton of a man from 12,000 years ago. They found it along with the skeletons of these extinct Ice Age carnivores, suggesting they had lived during the same period. Thousands of years before the Inca, the Maya, and the Olmec, primitive human beings were living alongside gigantic wolves and fierce bears. Judging by all their bones in the same cave, they were fighting over subterranean real estate. Scientists made the discovery in Quintana Roo, in an underwater cave called Hoyo Negro, or the Black Hole. Other animals found inside this dark and watery hole in the ground include saber-toothed cats and enormous elephant-like beasts that once roamed Mexico but are now long extinct. Want to give a big shout out to Dat White Chocolate and Peter Make It Happen. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe for more videos about amazing discoveries. An ancient whaling ship. In the year 1836, a whaling ship encountered a storm while moving through the Gulf of Mexico. It was a huge brig, but it didn't stand a chance against the raging winds and massive waves. The mast broke, the ship sank, and it settled at the bottom of the ocean. 207 years later, researchers discovered the remains of this ship, and scientists with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration were able to identify them. NOAA reported that their ship, the Okeanos Explorer, used a remotely operated vehicle to dive 6,000 feet beneath the surface of the ocean and inspect the mysterious wreckage. They could identify the ship as a two-masted wooden brig used for hunting sperm whales called Industry. It was built in 1815 in Massachusetts. Historical records show the crew was rescued, and salvagers took the whale oil off the ship before it completely sank. There isn't much of the ship left to see. There is an old anchor resting in the mud at the bottom of the ocean, some random pieces of debris, and the rest of the ship long since either decayed or was buried under sediment. Underwater treasure of Caesarea. Maritime archaeologists uncovered a bunch of precious artifacts in an ancient harbor in Israel. The divers were with the Israel Antiquities Authority's Marine Archaeology Unit and had been in the area doing a routine survey. The area was once part of the harbor of Caesarea, an ancient port city established in the 4th century BC. King Herod chose it to be one of the most important ports in the kingdom. It remained an important port city through the days of the Romans and into the Byzantine era. It was the last city in the Holy Land to fall to the Arabs during the Muslim conquest of the 7th century. After that, the city degraded until it left nothing but a small village. The marine archaeologists first came across a broken metal anchor and then the remains of 2 ships. At first they thought they were from the same time period, but that wasn't the case. One had wrecked in the 3rd century, the other in the 14th century. That's about 1,000 years apart. And each ship had spilled its own unique treasure into the water. Silver and bronze coins from the Roman period, bronze bells, an eagle figurine, statues of dancers wearing masks, and even a precious gemstone carved with a lyre. But by far the most impressive artifact is a gold ring with a green stone embedded in it. The stone depicts a young shepherd wrapped in a tunic and carrying a lamb on his shoulders. Researchers believe the figure is supposed to depict Jesus. It's a one-of-a-kind artifact, unlike anything previously found anywhere else in the world. Ancient sunken castle. At the bottom of a lake in Turkey, there lies the ruin of a 3,000-year-old Armenian castle. It's an ancient fortification that was found at the bottom of Lake Van, the biggest lake in all of Turkey. An Iron Age civilization originally built the castle called the Kingdom of Van. The lake is just as mysterious, likely created by the volcanic eruption of Mount Nemrut tens of thousands of years before. How in the world did the Iron Age civilization build a castle under the water? Well, they didn't. Of course, there was no water in the crater 3,000 years ago. The current water level is now hundreds of feet higher than it used to be, and it's now used as a reservoir. Believe it or not, it took a team of researchers over 10 years to locate the castle. Local legends and stories about the castle were passed down through the ages, describing a great fortress at the bottom of the lake. But nobody knew if the stories were true. The research team discovered corals, underwater critters, and even a sunken Russian ship. But never the castle. Not for nearly a decade. Now they've identified its walls, along with the outlying settlement and the houses of the villagers who once lived in the castle's shadow. Pretty exciting stuff. Underwater potato garden. Archaeologists in Canada have discovered an underwater potato garden. That might not exactly be news, if not for the fact that the garden is 3,800 years old. That makes it the oldest example of a garden anywhere in the Pacific Northwest. The scientists discovered the remains of this mysterious garden east of Vancouver, hidden beneath a natural wetland. Researchers identified roughly 120 square feet of interlinked stone, creating something like a layer of pavement. They also discovered crude digging tools submerged in the marsh. And finally, they found over 4,000 wapato tubers, a type of edible plant very similar to the potato. The garden was most likely left behind by the First Nations people known as the Katsie. They likely planted the garden when nature had flooded the land like it is today. It was still a wetland, but there were dry spots for gardening. All the moisture allowed them to grow what they refer to as swamp potatoes. It's amazing because even though the tubers don't exactly look appetizing, they were probably the major crop of the garden, a legitimate garden farmed by people over 3,500 years before Europeans ever arrived in America. Underwater mystery blob. An underwater blob the size of an elephant mystified divers off the Mediterranean coast of Turkey. The divers, also underwater photographers, were taking pictures of the wildlife when, from out of nowhere, the blob appeared before them. It looked like a giant jellyfish, a transparent sphere floating 72 feet beneath the surface of the water. Amazingly, the blob sparkled as if it was covered in glitter, and yet the divers could shine their flashlights directly through its outer membrane. The underwater photographers were no strangers to weird marine life, and yet they did not know what this gigantic blob was doing, floating so close to them. All they could do was take pictures, try not to touch it, and figure it out later. Turns out the enormous blob wasn't a creature at all, but a mass of squid eggs. This is according to Michael Vecchione, director of the NOAA National Systematics Laboratory. He's also a curator of cephalopods at the Natural Museum of Natural History, so he knows what he's talking about. Michael says the divers are lucky that they got so close to an egg mass. Normally, we can only find them in open water far from the coast. These giant blobs contain tens of thousands of eggs, all suspended in a jelly mass. As that mass mixes with seawater, it gets bigger and bigger until the baby squids finally emerge from their eggs. Origins of the Aryan race. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato first told the captivating story of Atlantis in 360 BC. Now, over 2,000 years later, the story tells of a powerful utopian island society that sinks into the sea. Most mainstream scholars have concluded that Atlantis was a fictional place, but this hasn't stopped some people from believing in it, including the Nazis. The forerunner to the Nazi Party, the German Workers' Party, was partially founded by members of a group called the Tool Society, which was dedicated to tracing the origins of the so-called Aryan race. Included among its ranks were several prominent Nazis, including Rudolf Hess, who became one of Hitler's right-hand men, Alfred Rosenberg, who oversaw Germany's occupied territories in Eastern Europe, and DAP founder Dietrich Eckart. The Tool Society believed that an ancient Aryan race lived on a mythical island called Tool, more commonly known as Atlantis, and that modern-day Nordic people descended from that group. Even more bizarre was the group's belief that interstellar deities called the Theozoa deliberately bred with the first Aryans using electricity. These ideas were influenced by the views of occultists Guido von List and Lans von Liebenfels, who coined the term Aryosophy regarding the occultism concerning the Aryans. There was an entire field of study for the far-flung beliefs surrounding Aryan origins. Himmler's Rasputin. While the Tool Society influenced some of the Nazis' beliefs, Karl Maria Willigut dissolved it before Hitler rose to power, along with many other occult groups. They did this under the command of top-ranking Nazi official Heinrich Himmler's personal occultist, who wanted to ensure that his version of occultism prevailed over all others. Willigut's convoluted belief system held that German culture dated back to 228,000 BC, when mythical creatures like giants and dwarves supposedly inhabited the earth, and it had 3 suns revolving around it. According to this made-up religion, which centered on the worship of a god named Irmin, Willigut insisted that he was descended from kings who existed during this alleged time of origin. He was also a diagnosed schizophrenic, but this didn't stop Himmler from treating the man's word as scripture. The top-ranking Nazi official was especially attracted to Willigut's philosophy because it offered a much-desired alternative explanation for Christianity's traditionally accepted Judaic roots. Himmler consulted Willigut often and made major decisions based on his so-called prophecies. This is how he chose Wewelsburg Castle as the SS operational headquarters, where he dedicated a room to a crystal symbolizing the Holy Grail. Even after the war ended, Himmler maintained his belief that the Germanic gods would be restored. Demonic possession of Hitler. There is no doubt that Adolf Hitler was evil, and his sheer ruthlessness begs the question of exactly what caused him to be that way. Perhaps lacking a better explanation, many have landed on demonic possession as the answer. Signs of a dark presence occupying Hitler's mind first appeared during his childhood, when the dictator's close childhood friend, August Kubitschek, said that Hitler spoke as if another being were inside his body. Kubitschek also said that Hitler was just 17 years old when he began talking about returning Germany to his former glory. Hitler's personal library also suggests that he voluntarily dabbled in demonic possession. His collection reportedly included a copy of Ernst Scherl's Magic, History, Theory, and Practice. Written in 1923, the book focuses primarily on the demonic aspect of mysticism. One of the many passages marked by Hitler reads, "He who does not have the demonic seed within himself will never give birth to a magical world." Alice A. Bailey, who authored many books about the Theosophist religion, wrote during World War II that dark forces possessed Hitler. Her follower, Benjamin Krem, said that the dictator and his entourage, along with other evil groups in the world, released the destructive energies of the Antichrist. Does this mean that demons possessed Hitler? Not necessarily. Lending too much credibility to such theories could even be seen as a way of reducing Hitler's culpability for the atrocities he committed, even if that's not the believer's intention. The New World Order. There is a long-standing belief among many that Hitler and the Tool Society conspired to establish a secret totalitarian regime that functioned as a precursor to the New World Order. The Nazis indeed had plans to take over all of Europe. Propaganda described this using the term New Ordnung, which is often misinterpreted as New World Order, but refers to the predicted restructurization of borders that would occur in the post-war world if everything went according to plan. In this sense, the Germans certainly planned to implement a new political order. In his 1941 paper, Neuropa, Hitler's New World Order, famed American historian W.E.B. Du Bois wrote of the new order in Europe which Hitler proposes to establish. He noted that while most American experts dismissed the possibility, he knew that the changes going on in Europe were major based on his time in Germany, before the Nazis rose to power and turned democracy into a planned economy. Hitler's plan for world domination extended past Europe and into the US, where he dispatched 8 secret agents to carry out a plan called Operation Pastorius in 1942. Luckily, 2 of the men defected, and the information they provided helped authorities foil the plot. But there is no evidence suggesting that Hitler and the Tool Society collaborated to carry out a shared vision of creating a new world order. Do you think a plan for a new world order exists? Or is it just a conspiracy theory? Tell me what you think in the comments, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. The hunt for holy treasures. Occult ideology captivated SS leader Heinrich Himmler. As someone with a major disdain for conventional Christianity, he relied on a bizarre set of spiritual beliefs to justify his hateful and racist views, as well as the Nazi desire for global supremacy. Despite his aversion to Christianity, various things rooted in Christian tradition fascinated Himmler. For example, he saw the SS as an elite organization structured similarly to the Teutonic Knights, a religious order that was founded during the 12th century to aid Christian travelers during their pilgrimages to the Holy Land. Himmler was also obsessed with the legend of the Holy Grail, to which he dedicated an entire room at the castle. It appears as though he was attracted to fabled artifacts that perhaps, in his mind, symbolized power. Besides the Holy Grail, Himmler was preoccupied with Thor's hammer. He even wrote to the think tank Ahnenerbe, which was dedicated to giving academic credibility to Nazi racial ideology, and described Thor's hammer as an early, highly developed war weapon of our forefathers. Himmler told the organization to scour the northern Germanic Aryan cultural world for evidence of an understanding of Thor's hammer. In 1940, Himmler embarked on a personal mission to find the Holy Grail. He went to the Montserrat mountain range in Catalonia based on his belief that it represented the real Mont Salvat, which is where the Grail is in an opera written by composer Richard Wagner. The opera, called Parsifal, is based on a German poem called Parzival, which had inspired another SS officer, Otto Rahn, to hunt for the Grail years earlier in 1931. Rahn's interpretation of the poem led him to the Pyrenees region of southern France, where he suspected that members of the heretical Christian sect known as the Cathars possessed knowledge of the Grail's exact location. He believed he could find the answers inside Montségur, a mountain fortress, and the last Cathar stronghold to fall during the Crusades. Rahn did not find the Holy Grail, but his theories and ideology resonated with Himmler and other Nazis who latched onto occult views in the years following his failed quest. The Spear of Destiny. The Hofburg Spear, also known as the Spear of Destiny or the Holy Lance, is the alleged lance that pierced Jesus' side as he was being crucified. Before officially embarking upon his quest for world domination, Hitler reportedly set his sights on the holy relic, which he believed would give him the power he needed to take over the planet. When the Nazis occupied Austria in 1938, he supposedly dispatched an SS squad for the specific task of acquiring the Spear of Destiny. Author Trevor Ravenscroft wrote that Hitler's obsession with the artifact began early in his childhood. He claimed he had access to the notes of Austrian philosopher and Holy Grail researcher Dr. Walter Stein, who allegedly knew Hitler as a young boy. In his twisted biography, Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote of the spear and an accompanying collection of artifacts, known as the Imperial Regalia. It's been said that his first port of call following the Nazi takeover of Austria was the Hofmuseum in Vienna, where they keep the Spear of Destiny. Some even believe that Hitler was so obsessed with the spear that it wasn't just part of his plan for a global takeover, but that it drove his mission to conquer the world. The Nazis seized the Imperial Regalia and took it to Nuremberg, where they displayed it at the 1938 Party Congress. They then moved the collection into a bunker near Nuremberg Castle. The Allies recovered the Imperial Regalia after the war and shipped it back to Austria. While most historians agree the Nazis captured the Imperial Regalia at the beginning of the war, they are skeptical of the claims surrounding Hitler's alleged preoccupation with the artifact. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. World Ice Theory. The ideology that the Third Reich used to justify its horrifying crimes against humanity was predicated on bizarre supernatural beliefs and conspiracy theories. One such belief was a creation story known as World Ice Theory, or glacial cosmology. The theory first appeared in a 1912 book by Austrian engineer and inventor Hans Horbiger, who claimed that celestial bodies made of ice controlled the development of the universe, as well as the course of cosmic and human history. There is absolutely no academic credibility behind this belief, which was inspired by a so-called vision that Horbiger had one day in 1894. He was staring up at the moon and suddenly decided that it must be made of ice. and that there was no other explanation for how it could be so bright. Horbiger's outlandish theory took an even wilder turn after a dream he had about a swinging pendulum floating in space. He later cited the dream as definitive proof that Newton's laws of motion were wrong, and that, in his words, the sun's gravitational pull ceases to exist at 3 times the distance of Neptune. In a nutshell, world ice theory claims that a massive star collided with a dead star filled with water, causing the water to splash everywhere and freeze into enormous blocks of ice, creating the Milky Way galaxy and our solar system. It also alleges that the Earth has had many moons before, that they were all made of ice, and that our past moons had crashed into the planet. World ice theory devotees have linked these alleged crashes to the biblical flood described in the Old Testament and the destruction of the mythical island of Atlantis. Horbiger dismissed naysayers as fake, but failed to explain his beliefs. Instead, he responded with statements such as, "Calculation can only lead you astray, and either you believe in me and learn, or you will be treated as the enemy." Many adhere to his claims, including top-ranking members of the Third Reich. Biodynamic agriculture. The Nazis bought so heavily into occult beliefs, they relied on biodynamic agriculture in the development of athletic fields in Berlin for the 1936 Olympics. As a forerunner to modern organic farming, certain aspects of biodynamic farming make sense, or at least don't seem crazy. For example, it emphasizes foregoing synthetic fertilizers, as well as pesticides and herbicides, and instead uses manures, compost, and other natural materials. Austrian philosopher Rudolf Steiner, in response to local farmers' complaints about soil degradation and ailing crops and livestock after prolonged use of chemical fertilizers, introduced biodynamic farming in 1924. But the philosophy behind this alternative form of agriculture is rather abstract, to put it politely. Simply put, biodynamic farming is based on the concept of harnessing cosmic forces in the soil and the stars. There are varying forms of it, many of which rely on an astrological sowing and planting calendar. Opponents have criticized biodynamic agriculture for the arguably ineffective mineral and quartz additives and other methods that are supposed to help yield a successful harvest. One alleged way to harvest cosmic forces in the soil involves burying a cow's horn stuffed with quartz. There's no scientific evidence to suggest that biodynamic farming is more effective than traditional methods, but the concept gained enough popularity to still be in use by some modern farms. And it's no surprise that the Nazis latched onto it, given their tendency toward mysticism and the supernatural. Vampirism. In Mein Kampf, Hitler repeatedly described Jews as vampires and bloodsuckers who are out to destroy the rest of humanity. He made bizarre claims, including that wherever Jewish people go, the host group dies out. The delusional dictator said that once the Jews have wiped out one host group, they have to move on to a new target, or otherwise they would die. He associated them with undesirable traits like an attraction to the smell of decaying flesh, degeneracy, and a desire to exploit rather than cultivate everything in sight. Nazis used these heavily flawed views in their propaganda to justify the removal of Jews from society and the ensuing atrocities of the Holocaust. Depicting them as vicious, non-human monsters like vampires helped to desensitize the Germans, especially those who were aware of what went on inside the hellish concentration and extermination camps. Any rational person knows that there is no truth behind Hitler's alarming beliefs, so it's hard for most of us to imagine how someone could buy into the rhetoric. But Hitler and many Nazi leaders believed in the occult and conspiracy theories, which they used to their advantage. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe for more videos about crazy history, and I'll see you next time. Bye!